My name is Rupert Reed. I'm a recovering academic. I just retired. I've written a number of books, including this little number, This Civilization is Finished. I helped to launch Extinction Rebellion, and now I've just launched the Climate Majority Project, which I mentioned a little bit about to you this morning, in the session this morning. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Andri Snaer Magnason, who is perhaps best known for this extraordinary book on time and water, which I want to recommend to those who haven't read it very, very highly. This is one of the best pieces of writing on and around climate, simply that there is. It's just one of the absolute best. So, Andri, thanks so much for being with us here today from Iceland. And basically what's going to happen here is that I'm going to say just a few words to frame the session, and then the two of us want to have a conversation. And the conversation is about the topic that you've been promised. I will explain that title a little, or we will explain that title a little if it's mysterious to you. We're just going to talk about it for about half an hour, and then we want to make sure that there's at least about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A and discussion involving the room, and at that point there will be roving mics and so forth. Okay, so I'm now pulling out my copy of the program. No, that's not it. Have you got a copy of the program? To make sure we get the title right. So what we promised to talk to you about is a transformation so mythic it breaks our very language. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about what we call climate change. But that term is so spectacularly inadequate that we wanted to spend some time talking through that inadequacy and how we might start to get to a place which was a little more adequate to reflect the sheer magnitude, horror, grandeur, profundity of the transformation that we are in the relatively early stages, actually, of going through together. We want to address that on a linguistic basis, partly because we think that language is absolutely crucial here. If we're going to enable people to really feel, understand, and respond adequately in the kind of ways we've been talking about so far here today to this crisis, which of course is greater than, but has arguably at its center the climatic transformations that we're just starting to see, then we're going to have to language this better. But we're also going to make sure that in our conversation we get to talking about some of the other ways in which we need to change the way we figure this in order to actually get into a position to take it seriously and to realize that this is a transformation so vast that it's worth using this big word, mythic, to talk about it. So I hope that makes basic sense as a plan for this session. Before I hand over to Andri for his initial reflections on this task that we've set ourselves, I'll just note one thing, which is that I think that a base level to start here is to be aware that the term climate change was deliberately chosen, in effect, by scientists, and in particular by leaders in countries such as Saudi Arabia, to be the term of choice for this phenomenon, precisely so that it would be as undisturbing as possible. And if you want to understand that process more fully, I'd recommend you to read the book by Stephen Poole called Unspeak. And Poole's book begins with this marvelous anecdote from the life of Confucius. Confucius was asked, Master, what would be the one change that you think is the most important if we're to make our society run well and have it be well governed and well administered? And Confucius's reply was, I would rectify the names we give things. I would give things their right names. We can't get anything right until we get that right. And whatever else is true, I think it's absolutely 1,000,000% self-evident that climate change is the wrong name for the phenomenon that is usually termed climate change. So we need to, our baseline should be looking for other terms. We can start by going to terms such as the term I use in my latest book, climate breakdown, which is much more real to what's occurring. But we want to go beyond that and go deeper than that. Andri, tell the room something about some of the ways that you see this, coming from your kind of literary background, coming from your Icelandic background, coming from your serious, deep engagement with these issues.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here with you and all of you guys. So I've been writing for 25 years or more, poetry, fiction, non-fiction, science fiction, and I met a climate scientist in Potsdam, and he asked me, why don't you write about climate change? You know, and I said, I don't have authority. My father's a doctor. He hates it when laymen are giving medical advice. You know, he spits his coffee in the morning. If eat more avocado or something, he hates that. So I had this respect for the field. I shouldn't intrude into somebody else's field, like I think you're doing with your philosophy degree. But he said, but I produce data every day, and people don't understand data, they understand stories. Yeah. And I started to I felt like I had some kind of permission. And he said, if this isn't woven into stories, that a normal person feels he has authority to speak, then nothing will change and the world will end, basically. So I took this kind of seriously, and I felt I had this authority, and I started to read, and I told my friends I was going to write about climate change, and I could see how their eyes glazed. They were like, oh, not again. and I was like, how can the most serious issue, like the fundamental issue of everything, be taken like that by my friends, like as something boring? And in a way, you could say that much of the climate talk is boring, and we get this kind of herd immunity against it. So the next time they asked me, I said, I'm writing about time and water. And then they were like, wow, interesting. And what do you mean? Well, in the next 100 years, every single element of water on our planet is simultaneously going out of balance. That is, the glaciers are going down, the ocean level is going up, nature is leaving geological speed of change into a human speed of change. The pH level of the oceans is changing to a level not seen for 50 million years. Permafrost, ice caps, rain, snow, seasons, it's just moisture, it's just all simultaneously going out of balance. And within the lifetime of a single human being. And they were like, wow, that's serious. And I was like, yes, it's sometimes called climate change. So it's like how words can frame things and empower, like mansplaining, you know, like the habit of a man speaking down to a woman like she was a child, how that word kind of just disarms those habits. But then a word can also seal things like climate change, and just you think you understand it. So then I went to go deeper into this and how to write about the issue.
Just one quick note on those who were here in the last session. It's quite similar, arguably, to what the point that Ian McGilchrist made about the word environment. The word environment is a dead word which has been imposed precisely to cap feelings and a sense of connection and so on and so forth. Unlike words like nature and life, I would suggest. It's I think somewhat similar to the point around climate change.
Yes, and then just basically when you start as a writer to write about it, how language fails you. And how the issue is larger than language. And what does that mean? So if I say, for example, something that I got from a scientist, it's not my opinion. So in the year 2100, we expect the pH level of the world oceans to have dropped from 8.1 to 7.7. And this is the greatest change in the world oceans for 50 million years. So I said this. Would you have cried if I said 7.4 in the pH? You know, would you be like shaking on the floor? You know, so in a way, every word that I said is meaningless. 2100 is culturally meaningless because I think everybody here agrees that 1970 was 30 years ago, and 2100 is after 100 years. And this cultural kind of how 2000 was like imprinted, and we don't even have a language to talk about the 2011s, or you know, we can't refer to this century. It's just a one post-2000 period, and then so 2100 is just culturally meaningless. the pH scale is abstract. How can you scale? How can you understand a logarithmic scale and how serious that is? And then 50 million years is too big to grasp, but it means that a single human being born today, becoming as old as my grandmother, is witnessing a greater change in the oceans than not only all the ancestors of man, if man is 300,000 years old, all the ancestors of the Homo species, if we're 5 million years old, but 10 times the evolution of humanity. I don't remember what kind of a raccoon we were 50 million years ago, so the claim mythological is not shooting over the top. This is mythology. This will be remembered after 10,000 years if we get through this in your through-topia. So in a way, I felt the challenge of writing about it and talking about it it was like the black hole. You can't look straight into a black hole. You can't just say pH 7.1, no, 8.1, 7.7. The only way, so to understand 2100, I had to go to my grandmother's house and go, like the black hole, you always go to the periphery, to the neighboring stars and galaxies to understand the scope of the black hole. So to understand 2100, I had to attach to the past. To grasp the scale of science, I needed mythology. To be rational, I needed poetry. I always needed to go the opposite direction. And to be global, I needed to be personal. So I felt like this was not a straightforward challenge of making scientific language simplified for the layman, or for me and my friends, but it was also explaining to the scientists what they were finding.
Yeah, that's right. So part of our thinking is that when we're trying to actually understand and communicate climate, the language of science can only ever be one element of that. And it needs to be profoundly contextualized. And we think a helpful way of thinking about this matter is to ask the question, what will this climate breakdown, how will it be referred to in, say, 1,000 years' time, right? Well, it might be referred to as climate breakdown. I think more likely it'll be referred to as something like the catastrophe, or the great unraveling, or this phrase you use, Andri, the great water disruption. These are the kinds of things it might be called. What we know for 1,000% certain it won't be called is climate change. We know it won't be called that. So let's kind of get ahead of the game and dream into the meaning of this enormous, terrible transformation now. That is what we need to do if we're actually going to be able to face it and work through it and respond adequately to it. And what we meant, therefore, partly with the title of this session, is that this really is a transformation so mythic that it breaks our existing language, our existing way of using words, that is the dominant way that they're being used right now in the media, in science journals, etc. We need to get ahead of that game and start finding new ways of thinking it and new ways of framing it.
Also, like, I think that, you know, we have among us now, so just to understand what it means to be in a paradigm shift. That is, what is a paradigm shift? It's like when Copernicus finds out that the sun is not going around us, but vice versa. And it's not like everybody was like, oh, that's a good idea. I feel that now. It takes 100 years kind of for a new paradigm to settle in. And often it's a huge disruption also towards language and normality. And so like you guys in the, and it's often, there's often conflict within it. And it can take 100 years for a word to be understood. So we have examples in Icelandic history, because Iceland is very transparent. When an idea comes into Iceland, and we can see when the idea came, and you can see the evolution of the idea until it becomes a paradigm. So like in 1809, when the ideas of the French Revolution came, it was just nonsense. You know, what do you mean, like the poor should have the same voting in proportion as the rich and powerful? So when you're in a paradigm shift, language kind of evaporates, and that's what we are in now, that the dreams and hopes and normality of our kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, what we thought was normal, is just not that way anymore. We have among us the first leaders in human history that know that they can melt glaciers. You know, they didn't know that, you know, Napoleon, Churchill, Caesar, they didn't have meetings to discuss how they were melting glaciers or how they were leveling the sea level up and down. But they're talking now, and we're mocking the leaders that fly to Egypt, but we're not understanding, we're not holding our breath like it's the World Cup. Like, what comes out of this conference? We're just like, oh, yet another climate conference. But we need to back out or zoom out and like, when did leaders meet to discuss something like this? And things that we take for granted in our daily lives, in our dreams, or what we feel we are entitled to, you know, power, oil, all these things are being questioned. And you guys in the Extinction Rebellion, you're being annoying like the suffragettes, you know, misbehaving and doing things like, and the question is that inevitable for a paradigm shift, that people have to misbehave? And isn't it enough to write an op-ed in the Times and just be proper? or do you have to misbehave?
Yeah, and certainly, that's what we decided.
You can answer that.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's why we decided to. Part of the DNA of Extinction Rebellion was to try to change the conversation, was to force a change in the conversation, and in that sense, it worked. You know, it's one of the very few things in the last 50 years that has worked. A national conversation during the April Rebellion in 2019 was forced, and that came from disruption. My view is that now what we need to do is to take that spirit of disrupting the failed paradigm, but translate it into terms that will be not just comprehensible to the average citizen, but something that they actually want to do and be a part of. And that's not easy. But I think it's absolutely essential if we're going to get through this. And we're now sort of segueing, I think, into the second part of what we wanted to talk about, which is how do we actually succeed in making this feel as real as it bloody well is to people? And part of the answer is going to be by framing it properly. But other parts of the answers are going to be, for example, that we need to help people to understand this is about a total full spectrum shift in the way that we do pretty much everything. That's what transformation means. That's what paradigm shift means. That's what one civilization ending and another beginning means. And that's how, to go back to your thing about the leaders, from the point of view of history, as it were, and this is another part of what we need to shift, right, is a shift towards more long-term thinking. From the point of view of history, it will be completely absurd to look back on leaders who said, yeah, okay, so we're melting the glaciers, but look, we can't stop people having as big cars as they want, or going on holiday, you know, every couple of weeks or every couple of months or something. I mean, that's just outrageous to stop that. So, of course, we have to carry on melting the glaciers. You know, from the point of view of people living a few hundred years from now, that's going to be either laughable or abominable or incomprehensible. But that remains the norm right now. So that indicates starts to indicate some of the other aspects of what has to shift in order to make this real. We have to make it feasible for people to think about time in the kind of way that you do in your book. Tell us about the lovely thing about the three generations of a family.
Yeah.
Which helps to concretize this.
Well, I felt like one of the fundamental problems was this meaninglessness of 2100. You know, why is it meaningless? Why does it feel 100 years away? Why, when a scientist says 2080, 90, it's just meaningless. So I took. I'm so lucky that my grandparents became very old and had a very clear mind. So I took my daughter to visit, I call it pancake sci-fi. I took my daughter to visit my grandmother, and she was 95 at the time. She became 98. And we calculated, my daughter was 12, and we calculated, when do you become as old as grandmother? And we just did the calculation, and she was like, wow, 2104. I will be the age as grandmother. And you will still remember her, hopefully. And you'll be under influence, because she was one of the coolest women in the world. And I'm not bragging. It's just she was a glacial explorer and lived a very full life. So my daughter will be inspired by her in the year 2104. And we're thinking, but when is someone still alive that you will love? Asking my daughter. Imagining that when she's maybe sitting in this same kitchen in the year 2100, and a 20-year-old comes to visit, somebody very close to her, maybe somebody that she has deeply influenced, when is that person still talking about my daughter as her greatest influence? And she does the math. It's like 2,170. So that's like beyond Hunger Games. You know, it's like, so we were thinking like, so my grandmother whispered a secret to my daughter. And she's not telling me, it's just something from the 1930s. It's not horrible, I hope, but it's just a secret, hopefully a sweet secret. And my daughter promised not to tell anybody until this person in the year 2100. And she's going to ask that person not to tell anybody until the year 2170. So in the year 2020, you can plan something to happen without writing it down, just by your own continuity, to take place in the year 2170. So our time is the time of the people that we know and love, the time that creates us, versus the time that we will know and love, the people that we create, and the time that we create. So my daughter, she will be able to touch almost 250 years with her bare hands. So that's the handshake of generations. It's 1924, 2170. And I felt like one of the ideas of my book was to update our sense of time and continuity and create some kind of responsibility, maybe reclaim from dystopia 2170 and claim it into just our inner sphere of normal long-term thinking. Just at least, maybe it's difficult to think of 2200, but at least 2170 is a time that people up down here will touch in their lifetimes, and that maybe comes to Throughtopia.
Yeah, well, I'll get to Throughtopia in a second, but just quickly on the point, the beautiful point you've just made with the handshake across the generations. What you're really doing there is you're giving us a way of quite long, what feels to us like quite long time periods, seem actually quite sort of intuitive and human. And that I think is so important. This is part of how we make this thing real. This is part of how we get people to get more serious about the climatic disruption that we've initiated, to enable them to understand that 2100, which otherwise just sounds like an abstract date, which is a long time off, is part of this process that matters, because what gets passed down the generations, if anything does, ought above all to be love. And that's the idea at the center of my book, Parents for a Future, that there should be a way, and this is part of what the Climate Majority Project is trying to do, to get people to think of themselves in this kind of sequence of the generations and realize that if, as people say, what they love most of all in their lives is their children, well, they have to remember that those children have children, and those children have children. And that if you say, yeah, I love my children, but I don't really give a fig about what happens in 2100, there's just an internal contradiction in what you're saying. Now, one of the methods that I'm increasingly trying to use in order to help people to see this and imagine it is this concept of Throughtopia. I'll just very briefly explain it for those of you who don't know. So right now we're headed towards dystopia. Some people might say we're in dystopia, but honestly, you ain't seen nothing yet. Right now we're headed towards dystopia. And tragically, utopias are no longer credible. Anyone who says to you now, oh, there's going to be a smooth transition and the economy is going to carry on growing, there'll be new technologies, everything's going to be sorted out, they're either a liar or a shill or a fool. That's not how it's going to be. And people know that, really. Most people know that, and they sense it, much as they might wish to deny it. And the real problem, I would argue, with both dystopias and utopias anyway, was always that they're imagined as this sort of static, sort of far-off place. What we actually need is a much more process-oriented way of thinking about these things and feeling into them, right? So what's happening right now in our world, we're having to adapt to it, and we're going to have to transform, right? It's what we call transformative adaptation. And the way that we can succeed in imagining that process is precisely to imagine it as a process, as something we have to be continually nimble as we go through. So what a through-topia is the best that we can hope for and that we can make together now as we go through what's coming. And it's actually quite exciting when you start to think about it in that way. It's like, let's think about scenarios for how the future could unfold, for how we could help it to unfold, which are not just everything turning to shit, and which are not just ridiculous fairy stories that we tell ourselves that we know are not going to be true. So not dystopias, not utopias, but through-topias, how we get through what is coming. And the telling of those stories, this is something which is starting to happen in literature. It's barely started at all in TV or some other parts of the arts. It's in my view, going to be absolutely huge and absolutely essential, because to come back to what we said quite a while ago, scientists can't do all of this for us. We need scenarios and ways of feeling into them that come alive to us as narratives. So this kind of through-topian impulse is, I think, a big part of how we get to actually start to language and imagine and then co-create a transformation so mythic that it recreates our language and our future. Sorry.
No, I'm just kind of taking this up like into the term of purpose, like they were talking about before. Is like, I think everybody wants to have, well, I think it's known that everybody wants to have purpose in their lives. And I think that former generations all thought that they were kind of improving life for future generations. That is, when you're building a road, you're building a bridge, you're building a school or a hospital, you're building a city, you feel this pride of, yes, I'm leaving here a better place than when I came. And we're in this terribly cynical situation where even these good intentions are now measuring as being negative. That is, we are not improving the chances or basically the future for the future generations. Yeah. And this cynical situation is difficult because it's hard enough to have a job, but if the job is worse than useful, you know, it's a very kind of cynical place to be in as a collective society. So it's very delicate to talk to young people like about issues like this, because the first time I spoke to a group of like 15, 17-year-olds, it was like I was turning off the lights in their eyes. It's like telling them, you're too late to the party. So I was thinking, how can you frame this without being, you know, without just filling them with blackness? So I started to kind of think, okay, what needs to be done? And what is the purpose? And suddenly it's like, oh yeah, every single job you choose has a purpose. If you go into fashion, which was before maybe superficial, going on the Paris runway, fashion is 6% of the problem. So if you go into fashion, you can have such a huge purpose regarding material waste, fashion cycles, recycling, all that. So 6%. If you go into energy, you have to transform the whole energy system. If you go into transportation, we have to look like barbarians currently, when you in hindsight after 30 years of how our transportation systems are. If you go into aviation, it has to be remodeled totally. If you go into food, agriculture, farming, so just basically every single field has to be transformed. And I tell them that doesn't have to be a negative situation if you're going from this standpoint into that through-topia, you could call it. Yeah. That is to revolutionize every single sector of the economy or of our activities, can be a very stimulating intellectually stimulating time, and basically all of your working life is about this challenge. 2050 is for a 20-year-old today. It's basically most of their working life. So I tell them that the last 30 years were about making this, the digital world and all that, and maybe these Google Glass, these Apple Vision Pro things were an end of an era into the absurdity. Maybe the next 30 years are about the tangible world, food, soil, air, materials, much more than this kind of digital thing.
Yeah, that's a great utopian thought. It's also a great climate majority thought, and I think it's so exciting because we have a crisis of meaninglessness, right? A crisis of felt meaninglessness, which Nietzsche was the first prophet of, and has really come to roost in our societies in recent times. The felt meaninglessness of lives, which are just about consumption and so on and so forth. Well, here is a purpose in spades, right? Our situation drips with meaning, and it's not going to be even remotely easy or a lot of the time pleasant, but it's an incredibly exciting prospect for careers and life purposes for huge numbers of people. And by the way, if anyone ever says, yes, but isn't it too late? Or on the other hand, if anyone says to you, yes, but look, it's not too late, the question is always, for what? Right? The people who say, oh, it's too late, the people who think we're doomed to the dystopian outcome, ask them, for what is it too late? Yes, it's too late for certain things. It's too late for a smooth transition. It's too late to stay below 1.5 degrees. That ship has sailed. Don't believe the people who are pretending to you that it hasn't. But it's not too late probably to stay below 2 degrees. It's not too late to undertake the kind of transformations that Andri and I are talking about here. And it's never too late to do the right thing. It's never too late to minimize the harm. It's never too late to practice transformative and deep adaptation. Anyone who, there's this false binary, it's too late, it's not too late. Ask people for what, get concrete about it. And then you get out of these kinds of, really what the people who say it's too late are looking for is an excuse for inaction. And what the people who say it's not too late are looking for is to continue to carry on as they are. And neither of these are credible positions. Neither of these are viable positions.
But regarding too late, you could say in a way that, you could almost say that we haven't started to address climate change.
We're just barely starting.
Because you ask somebody like, okay, we had this catastrophe 2 years ago, like the corona thing. I don't want to say the word, I get goosebumps. So you ask somebody, okay, do you agree that climate change is a bigger crisis than corona? And then they say, yes, of course. And then I ask them, okay, name me the top 10 things, how your life changed for the corona. And they can just speak endlessly. Like, I didn't hug my grandmother, I didn't go to work, I didn't go to school, I didn't, it's just everybody knows this. They could talk for a whole day about how their life changed and transformed within a weekend. And then I ask, okay, climate change is bigger. Just name me the top 10 things how your life changed between the 4th and the 5th IPCC report. They're like, okay, yeah. Yeah, tell me just the top 10 things. Yeah, like what's unimaginable today that was common 2010 and just sounds absurd you were doing 2000. Yeah, wait a minute, I'm thinking. Yeah, just the top 10, because it's much bigger than corona. Yeah. Well, I have paper straws, okay. And my uncle, he bought a Tesla, okay. So the greatest existential crisis that we're faced with collectively as humanity will be fought by the suffering of your uncle upgrading to the coolest car he has ever had. So it's kind of obvious that we are so entitled. we haven't taken on any discomfort, and then if you compare it to the discomfort of not hugging your grandmother for a year, actually, there should be at least 10 things that we should be able to at least to look our grandchildren in the eye that we actually did take on in terms of discomfort.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they will not hug us, not because of Corona, they will just not want to hug us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always the question to ask. What are you going to say to your grandchildren when they ask you, what did you do once you know? What did you do once you knew? Everyone has to have an answer to that question. And just on what you just said there about how we can start to up that ante of things that get changed, and then I'm going to come to the floor, so please be thinking about your questions and comments. This, of course, again, is where localization and transformative adaptation and what in the Climate Majority Project we call community climate action, this is how it can be really powerful, because that is people starting to do their actual lives, their actual quotidian lives differently. And I think it can work like a mind bomb, a slow mind bomb. People see other people acting with each other as if the crisis is real, making preparation, building resilience, growing food, and if asked why, saying, well, because it tastes better and because we can't be so reliant on long supply chains in the future and we may have to look after ourselves more in the future. It goes off in people's minds like, oh, wow, maybe this isn't about some distant abstract date in the future. Maybe this is about preparing now for what's already here and the worst that is already definitely coming. Right, let's go to the room and see what you make of this conversation we've been having. Can I see hands with questions or comments? And we've got 1 or 2 mics. So let's start with this person here and that person there.
Andri, you just mentioned a word that I think is really important, entitlement. And as I think about the future, I sometimes wonder, even within myself, like how will I respond to when the people who didn't cause the problem are dying by the millions in the global south. At the same time, the global north will lose a lot of what people now feel they're entitled to have. How do we find language and ways to not get into a barbaric world where people just accept that millions of people or hundreds of millions of people are dying in the global south, and us kind of going, well, we gave them some aid before, but now we don't really have any money for that, and we need to look after ourselves. And I have no idea about an answer. I'm just wondering.
Thanks. Yeah. You want to try that, Andri?
Yeah, it's because it's a difficult question, because if you say like, if in good intentions you say like 100 million people will be coming over the Mediterranean because of climate change, the response might not be altruism and support of solar panels to prevent that, but military spending and wall building and maybe making it illegal to cross the Mediterranean and legal to shoot down those that cross it. So it could, the response of such a dystopian future could be not the well-intended response that you would like. And then I also think even framing it as something that will happen in the global south, nobody really knows if it will be so linear of south and north, because Florida will go under. We're seeing fires in Canada, we're seeing Greece underwater. So unexpected things can happen very disproportionately. In climate utopia, maybe humans have turned disadvantages into advantages. So we are barely now, and this is maybe a bit techno answer. So we have like in Arabia, we have like Dubai, we have places that are rising from oil, that is built from the ground from oil money. We haven't seen the scale up of solar, where people have actually built cities based on the resources of which would be like sun and heat. So I don't think if we look 50 years ahead, in terms of how scaled up solar and thermal technology will be, that maybe it's not like this linear fall of people escaping the south and going north. Maybe it will be like Iceland. We were evacuating people in the 1870s because of volcanic eruptions, and because of the hostile seas, until those disadvantages became advantages of abundant fisheries and geothermal energy that we could use to. So now we were at the limit of growth in 1900 of 100,000 people, but now we could easily have much more because of the disadvantages that we have turned into advantages. So I want to frame it. It sounds a bit over optimistic, but I just would like to warn the framing of lots of 100 million people swarming to Europe. I just think it might create a very dystopic answer from our political discourse. And so when I'm just so that's kind of the answer.
Just to add briefly to the point about where is the axe going to fall, and we don't really know. We do know that so far there are more people suffering and dying in the global south than in the global north from climate, but there are also pretty serious disasters hitting the global north. It's worth bearing in mind that if we look at Corona again as a precedent, it's quite surprising, really, the way that played out, right? It's quite surprising, for example, that a country like the United States did so much worse during the coronavirus crisis than quite a lot of West African countries. Why was that? Well, arguably because the political system in America is basically broken, and the place is run by rampant individualism, whereas in West Africa, they learned from the experience of Ebola, and they've still got quite strong, actually, local resilient communities in quite a lot of those countries. So this is something which Amitav Ghosh makes quite cleverly as a point, that it may turn out that in the face of climate and other crises, countries in the global north are surprisingly fragile. Let's go to the next question.
Hi, thank you so much for your conversation this morning. I was very interested by your talks and ideas around language, imagination, and our ability to tell stories. And you mentioned Throughtopia, which I know Amanda Scott writes a lot about. I was wondering, for people who are interested in creating stories through art, music, film, theatre, that will ignite people's imaginations and galvanize us towards Throughtopias that are vibrant and appealing, do you have any advice for those folks?
Well, I'll start with something on that, very succinct. My advice is do it. This really needs to happen. This is a wave of the future. It is absolutely critical. One of the main reasons why, I'm quite convinced, one of the main reasons why we are not taking the climate more than emergency as seriously as we ought is because people can't really imagine the different possible futures very clearly, and they don't see their own agency in choosing between those futures. And that is what these Throughotopian narratives and so forth can do and will do, is show people how it could be really bad and how it could be much less bad and in some ways better. And they'll show people the kind of parts that they could play in that. And I think it's hugely exciting. Andri, what do you think?
I think the arts, of course, lots of bad art will be made as a response to a good cause is not essentially good art. But still, in the whole picture, art is fundamental in paradigm shifts. And I think it's vital to understand that, like we were talking about before, like who defines the language? You know, is climate change a specialist issue of scientists and their scientific terms, or is it my own issue, my own personal issue, or your personal issue that you can interpret in any way you feel appropriate to your own life and your own surroundings? So I was like, when I was writing my book, I was kind of obsessed with the periodic table of language. So this imaginary periodic table of language. So I was thinking like these fundamental words that have always existed in mythology and culture: love, God, blood, mother, you know, water, sun, moon, these fundamental things. So I was thinking, emissions are not in the periodic table of language. And 35 gigatons of CO2 emissions, they're not in the periodic table. But fire is in the periodic table. Below the emissions is fire. And if you look at the fire, then you understand, okay, the invisible 35 gigatons are actually the biggest fires that the Earth has ever seen. So maybe reclaiming the language from technocracy, from science, and because it's a fundamental issue, it deserves maybe to be talked about in terms of fundamentals, in terms of love, fire, God, mother. so like that's how that's kind of the approach that I found appropriate when I was writing the book. Not using super complicated language, just very simple language, and just visiting my grandmother and talking to her.
Yeah. Thanks. Right, let's see more hands. Okay, so let's go to this woman here, and then this woman down here.
Hello, my name's Ella. I'm the founder of the Long Time Project, and I've got a comment and a question. So firstly, at the Long Time Project, we have been kind of operationalizing these ideas over the last 5 years. So helping individuals and institutions do processes like the ones that you've been describing to help them build intergenerational empathy, to help them take the longer view. So just flagging that up, that there's a load of resource out there for folk who want to get practical with some of the ideas they've heard about.
Where do they find the resource?
So if you search, you can listen to the Long Time Academy podcast that we have in partnership with Headspace, the meditation app, or you can search the Long Time Project. But my question, we're thinking about the mythic, and often in mythology we have heroes. And you very beautifully this morning, Rupert, said, you know, perhaps the next Buddha will be a Sangha. So what are the kinds of stories that, I guess it's a double question, what are the kind of stories you've heard that have collectives as their heroes that have been potent for you? And if they don't exist, what are those kind of stories look and feel like?
Wow, what a wonderful question. Challenging one, too. I'll make a little start. It will probably be a controversial one, but it's worth just kind of thinking through. I think that it's far from perfect, but I think that Avatar does this to some extent. Now, some people say, no, it doesn't, because Avatar is just a white savior myth. But I think that's a completely wrong reading of the film. Actually, the protagonist has to go through an incredibly painful journey involving massive, consequential, terrible mistakes on his part in order to get anywhere in his learning, which is essentially reverse anthropology. In other words, he's learning from the indigenous people rather than teaching them. And it's actually the collective, and ultimately the collective includes the entire animal population of the planet, which manages to achieve victory. So it's as if, you know, Gaia herself and all her animate beings have to rise up in order for the thing to work out well. Now, that's probably more than we can hope for, but it's a story which has at least some of the qualities you're asking for. Do you have an example, Andri?
I was obsessed with mythology when I was writing this. Like, the gods were right when they punished Prometheus because we couldn't handle the fire. And this is basically a result of Prometheus giving us the fire, and we just couldn't handle it. So I was thinking, like, how is mythology created? Like, if you look 500 years back, you can maybe just name one king from each century. You can't name all the characters. You just maybe you remember one person from the 14th century, one person from 700. So if you zoom out 4,000 years, and you look at this time, this break in geology when the glaciers started this trigger melting, maybe all our kings will be concentrated in a single king. This single king that had all the information in the world. He was like the epicenter of humanity. He had satellites, 100 satellites going around the country, he had castles full of information. He had scientists in towers all around the world. He had perfect information about everything. And then he had these magical machines that were serving him. But then he found out that his machines were not serving him. They were harming his future, and they were going to claim his children. And he thought that he had some control over these machines. But then his machines just continued doing their thing. And in the end, this king found out that what he thought was his power and control was in the end just machines on cruise control that just continued, despite all the knowledge, despite all the information from the satellites, they just kept on rolling. That's maybe future mythology.
So that's a wonderful, horrible note on which to end, a story we have to make sure doesn't come true. Friends, I hope we've given you some food for thought and some tools for thought. Thank you for being with us here.